Greetings, my dear viewers. Today I will tell you a story that turned the tide of world history, bringing entire empires to their knees and changing the lives of millions of people forever. Imagine a moment when life itself seems like thin, fragile glass, ready to shatter at any moment. The Byzantine Empire, the center of culture and power, was at the height of its power. However, something invisible and ruthless was approaching its gates. At this time, the reign of Justinian the Great, an outstanding emperor who sought to elevate the empire to unprecedented heights, was on the verge of destruction. What should have been the pinnacle of civilization became an epicenter of fear and chaos. The end of humanity. To understand what the Justinian plague was, you need to go back 1,500 years, to 541 AD. At this time, Byzantium was at the height of its power. But then no one knew that an invisible force was ready to destroy everything that had been created by the blood and sweat of hundreds of generations. It all began in the poor regions of Egypt, in the place where the Nile River flows into the Mediterranean Sea. There, among the dusty roads and squalid dwellings, an epidemic broke out, which soon spread throughout the Mediterranean, reaching the very capital of the empire, Constantinople. Justinian plague. It was not just a painful explosion of epidemics, it was a pandemic, which in its scale and consequences comparable to the Black Death of the Middle Ages. The disease spread with frightening speed. Rats, which were everywhere, carried fleas on themselves, and they, in turn, infected people. But the worst thing about this epidemic was the speed with which it took lives. It took only a few days from infection to death, and in most cases the outcome was fatal. People were dying in such numbers that there was no one left to bury them. Panic gripped the entire empire. No one knew how to stop the invisible enemy. Hospitals were overcrowded, the streets empty. Slaves, peasants, soldiers, and even noble citizens. The disease did not spare anyone. Even the Emperor Justinian himself fell ill, and only by a miracle remained alive. But the survival of the emperor could not save the empire from the chaos, which gradually took over the country. Chronicles of events. Already in a few months, the plague reached Constantinople. In the city, which was a symbol of power and greatness, reigned terror. People were afraid to go out into the streets, and those who were forced to do so faced a horrifying reality. Bodies of the dead lay everywhere, decomposing in the sun. The city, once living in the rhythm of commerce and politics, had become a realm of death. At this time, Byzantine society was plunged into despair. The churches were crowded with praying people who begged God for salvation, but it seemed that heaven remained deaf to their pleas. Piety degenerated into mysticism and superstition. There were instances of people making sacrifices in search of relief from the plague, hoping to placate the angry gods. Fanatics walked the streets, scourging themselves as a sign of repentance, and the smell of decay and death lingered around. Within 2 years, the plague had claimed millions of lives. In some cities, up to half the population died. Every day in Constantinople, 5,000 to 10,000 people died. Society was collapsing. The economy was falling. There was no one to cultivate the fields, and famine set in. Warriors who had once fought for the glory of the empire were now unable to raise a sword. The empire, on the verge of regaining its former greatness, was on the brink of destruction. What happened next? When the epidemic finally abated and the number of new cases began to decline, Byzantium faced the question, how to recover from such a catastrophe? Not only had the pandemic destroyed millions of lives, it had left the country's economy in ruins. Cities were devastated, fields abandoned, trade routes ruined. Recovery was slow and painful. However, even after enduring such horror, the people did not lose hope. Those who survived began to build a new world. The empire changed, and so did its internal structure. Weakened by the plague, Byzantium faced new challenges. external enemies, and internal conflicts. But along with this, the psychology of the people changed. They became more withdrawn, turned more to religion, and sought salvation in spirituality. Justinian, realizing that the continuation of the former policy is impossible, turned his attention to the restoration and strengthening of the remaining resources of the empire. However, the effects of the pandemic were felt for a long time. Labor was worth its weight in gold, and many lands remained uncultivated for years. The memory of the plague lived on in people's fears, but it also became part of their historical identity. Despite huge losses, the Byzantines endured, showing amazing courage and resilience. Fearful years. Friends, we are immersed in events that remind us of the fragility of our civilization. Justinian's plague symbolized human helplessness in the face of an unknown threat, but also an example of how, even in the darkest of times, people found the strength to live on. This episode of history is a lesson that we need to be ready for any challenge, and that our strength lies in the ability to recover from loss. Subscribe to the channel if you want to learn more about the great tragedies and victories of mankind. After all, only by studying the past, we can understand the present and prepare for the future. Thank you for watching, and see you soon